To repeat, these issues concerning slavery could have been compromised, but they weren't. Instead, hotheads on both sides exploited the paranoid style for all it was worth. Tempers flared. Mob violence became common, lethally so in some cases, particularly Bleeding Kansas. This spirit even invaded the chambers of Congress. During the debates that led to the Compromise of 1850, which was a partial settlement of issues related to slavery after the Mexican War, during debates that led to this compromise, Senator Henry S. Foote of Mississippi drew a pistol on Senator Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri. In 1856, during the Bleeding Kansas crisis, and this, by the way, was an episode in which Kansas was being opened to settlement on the basis of what was called popular sovereignty. In other words, the settlers in Kansas themselves were going to be able to determine whether Kansas had slavery or not. What happened was that pro-slavery forces and abolitionist forces, both sort of came into the state or the territory, looking to push things their own way, and there were shootings, there were massacres, and so forth. At least 75 people were killed during this period, and the same week that John Brown, an abolitionist who was operating in Kansas at that time, killed 5 pro-slavery settlers. That same week, Senator Charles Sumner, an abolitionist oriented Republican politician from Massachusetts, denounced the Kansas-Nebraska Act that had created this popular sovereignty framing for dealing with the issue of slavery. He did a speech called "The Crime Against Kansas." And back in the day, they could really give speeches. This one took place over 2 days, May 19th and May 20th. In this speech, Sumner attacked the authors of the act, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Senators Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois and Senator Andrew Butler of South Carolina. He said, this is Sumner said that Butler had taken, quote, a mistress who, though ugly to others, is always lovely to him. Though polluted in the sight of the world, is chaste in his sight. I mean the harlot, slavery. Sumner's 3-hour oration later became particularly personally insulting as Sumner mocked the 59-year-old Butler's manner of speech and physical mannerisms, which were impaired by a stroke. Douglas said to a colleague during the speech that, quote, this damn fool Sumner is going to get himself shot by some other damn fool, end quote. Representative Preston Brooks, Butler's nephew, was infuriated and intended to challenge Sumner to a duel. To this end, Brooks consulted with fellow South Carolina Representative Lawrence M. Kite on dueling etiquette. Kite told him that dueling was for gentlemen of equal social standing and that Sumner was no better than a drunkard due to the supposedly coarse language he had used during his speech. Brooks concluded in turn that since Sumner was no gentleman, it would be more appropriate to beat him with his cane. 2 days later, Brooks confronted Sumner. This is the illustration looking at here. Brooks confronted Sumner as he sat writing at his desk in the almost empty Senate chamber. He said, Mr. Sumner, I have read your speech twice over carefully. It is a libel on South Carolina and Mr. Butler, who is a relative of mine. Then he struck Sumner as hard as he could repeatedly. When several senators tried to aid Sumner, Kite, Lawrence Kite, that congressman who was giving Brooks advice about dueling, Kite blocked them, shouting, let them be. After the attack, Brooks received numerous gifts of canes. One of them inscribed, hit him again. In his prize-winning 1991 book, The Destructive War, Charles Royster argues that the Civil War's extraordinary violence can be seen as an expression of a changing political culture. The rise of Jacksonian democracy, the white man's democracy, steadily created a society intolerant of limits. Antebellum America, he writes in the book, was pervaded by an uncompromising insistence on personal autonomy and a growing impatience with restraints on the ambitions of individuals or of groups. These tendencies to reject limitations and to defy unwelcome authority knew no certain means to resolve competing demands other than violence. Parties and the mechanics of government thrived on confrontation and on winner-take-all outcomes, but were far less suited to restrain them than to agitate. People so determined to have their own way and so certain of possessing right and power could not readily stop short of war or stop war, once convinced that they were threatened on matters they deemed crucial. All professing to be Americans, they found that America did not keep them together, but told them to kill Americans who sought to control them. Around 11 p.m. on Sunday, October 16th, 1859, 19 men entered Harper's Ferry, a small industrial village on the border between Virginia and Maryland, and at the convergence of the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers. Within a few minutes, they reached the U.S. Arsenal, the U.S. Army Arsenal in the town, and overpowered the single watchman on duty. "I came here from Kansas," a gruff, bearded man told the watchman, "and this is a slave state. I want to free all the Negroes in this state. I have possession now of the United States Armory, and if the citizens interfere with me, I must only burn the town and have blood." In effect, John Brown was promising to create the equivalent of a Nat Turner's revolt on a larger scale with better armaments. But the raid was a complete fiasco. John Brown expected slaves to come in and join his little army. No slaves did. And so Brown actually made little attempt to attract them or to leave the town while he still could. By mid-morning the next day, gunfire erupted as local militia and armed townspeople opened fire on Brown and his raiders. Most of Brown's men were shot or captured. Brown, 4 followers, and 11 hostages holed up in the local fire engine house at the foot of the town. You can see the fire engine house there in the middle. It's the building in the middle of that sketch there. The next day, October 18th, a company of U.S. Marines arrived under the command of Colonel Robert E. Lee, yes, the future Confederate general. And in the company of Colonel Robert E. Lee was a cavalry captain named J.E.B. Stuart, Jeb Stuart, who would eventually serve as Lee's chief of cavalry during the Civil War. Lee sent Stuart forward to see if Brown would surrender. When Brown refused, the Marines rushed the building with the bayonet, killed or wounded all of Brown's followers, including Brown himself. Brown's raid was over 36 hours after it began. Although Brown's raid had been an abject failure, the way he handled himself afterward won him nationwide attention and made him a figure of fascination. No matter how one felt about John Brown, few could resist the image of an Old Testament prophet that he projected, including the people who were his captors. And Brown made the most of it. At his trial, in letters written to supporters in the North, and at his hanging on December 2nd, 1859, just 7 weeks after the raid. Just before he mounted the scaffold, Brown handed a sheet of paper to an attendant. I'm going to read it to you. Charlestown, Virginia, 2nd December, 1859. I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. I had, as I now think, vainly flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it could be done. During his captivity and trial, Brown's courage and eloquence brought a change in perception of him. To many Northerners, Brown came to seem a martyr, even a saint. On the day of his execution, a 100-gun salute to him was fired in the city of Albany, New York. Church bells tolled and prayer meetings gathered in many northern cities. Henry David Thoreau called him a crucified hero, while William Cullen Bryant, these are both literary figures, said that history, forgetting the errors of his judgment and the contemplation of his unfaltering course and the nobleness of his aims, will record his name among those of its martyrs and heroes. Southerners responded to such talk with fury. It was as if Northerners, their supposed countrymen, were applauding the death of a criminal who had tried to mass murder men, women, and children by unleashing a slave revolt. Many white Southerners who had been pro-Union before the raid now began to rethink their positions. And across the South, as the 1860 presidential election year began, thousands of young Southern males joined revitalized militia and volunteer companies to guard against the prospect of renewed abolitionist agitation, or the possibility that a Republican presidential administration might forget its promise not to interfere with slavery where it existed, and instead would send troops to free the slaves at gunpoint. In such an event, said an Alabama planter, what social monstrosities, what desolated fields, what civil boils, what robberies, rapes, and murders of the poorer whites by the emancipated blacks would then disfigure the whole fair face of the prosperous, smiling, and happy Southern land.